Being black often meant being left alone. Alone to mob violence. Alone to injustice. Alone to the chaotic and brutal rhythm of racism. And I'm going to talk about that today. This video is a part of a new series I'm doing. A series about what happens when the law abandons black people. This story may not make your stomach turn. It may not shock you or leave you speechless. But it's just as important. Because what happened here didn't come with fire or rope. It came with a courtroom, a judge, a sentence, and a system that called itself justice. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The rule of law abandoned black people. And many times it was weaponized against us. What was supposed to protect and uphold was used to brutalize and destroy. What was meant to restrain and hold back was allowed to become free and lawless against black people. The law became a tool of injustice for all black people, every day and everywhere. The law for black people was to remind us who it was written to protect and who it was willing to sacrifice. And this story is just one chapter in something much bigger. And I'm going to be talking about that in the next few videos. And I hope you'll stay with me for all of it. Before I tell you what happened to the black man who is central to this story, let me set the scene for you first. Because this story is going to talk about a very specific kind of injustice. Throughout history, there has been a continual through line that black life was disposable, not worthy of protecting, not deserving of second thoughts, considerations, or benefits of the doubt. Black always equaled injustice. And in the era of slavery, capital punishment was one more way to keep black bodies in line. You didn't have to take a white man's life to die. You just had to run or talk back or take something you weren't supposed to touch. Before the Civil War ended, nearly half of all executions in America were of black people, most of them enslaved. No one questioned those numbers. No judge asked whether justice was being done, because in the eyes of the law, blackness alone was enough to make you guilty. The law made it clear. A black life could be taken legally to protect white order. After slavery, the violence didn't stop. It just changed hands. The mobs took over, and across the South, black people were lynched with such little effort that it was like breathing air. Hung from trees, burned alive in public, drowned, blowtorched to death. Sometimes they were dragged from jails. Other times they were dragged from their homes. And still, no one flinched. But over time, the mobs got sloppy. The headlines got ugly. And in some states, not all, but some, the system decided it needed a makeover. They took the brutality indoors. No more ropes, no more trees, just courtrooms and judges. And a process dressed up like justice. The term for it was legal lynching. And Virginia became a master of it with swift trials and no real defense, all white juries, and the same black bodies, sentenced, strapped down, and executed under the authority of the state. It was now nice and neat and acceptable, civilized even. It promised white citizens they didn't need a mob. It gave them the same outcome, just with better lighting. This is what happened to Pink Barber. He wasn't lynched in the field or set on fire by a crowd. He was lynched in the courtroom, convicted in 15 minutes, executed in 81 days, and buried without a second thought. This story isn't about chaos. It's about order. It's not about rage. It's about process. It's about the formality of injustice, the benign nature of brutality, the harmlessness and the horror. Slavery didn't just teach America who to punish. It taught America how to punish. The courtrooms, the sentencing laws, the execution chambers, all of it built on the inhumane logic of the slave plantation. And that brings us to the story of Pink Barber. Pink Barber was born around 1886 in Virginia to Daniel and Melinda Barber. Both of his parents had been born into slavery. His father around 1835 and his mother around 1845, which means they spent a significant part of their lives enslaved. After emancipation, Daniel and Melinda continued working as farm laborers, doing the same work they had done in bondage. They had 9 children, with Pink being the youngest. He was born during a time when black people were being abandoned by the federal government. Reconstruction had ended, and new forms of slavery were emerging, like convict leasing. Racial terror was on the rise, with the birth of the Klan and other groups who targeted and brutalized black people, and took the lives of black people all across the South. And yet, the Barber family survived. Pink's mother died when he was about 9 years old, and as the youngest, he spent most of his childhood alone with his father Daniel, learning from his father, learning the value of hard work. Like most black people during this time, Pink had to work, and he had to start early. As a teenager, he left home and traveled to Maryland, where he worked for the B&O Railroad Company, laying track. By 1903, he had moved to West Virginia and had taken a job in the coal mines. It was around this time that the young Pink began to enjoy himself. But for black people, enjoyment often came with consequences. Pink would travel from Wheeling, West Virginia, where he worked, to Ohio to spend time with friends. And he started drinking. His drinking got him in trouble. During one of those visits to Ohio, Pink and one of his friends allegedly resisted arrest after a night of drinking and disorderly conduct at a bar. Pink spent 4 years in prison for this incident. After prison, Pink was ready to get back to his life, ready to put the past behind him. He was still a young man, with his entire future ahead of him. He returned to Virginia and went back to work in the mines. But mining was hard and grueling work, and it was dangerous. Over time, Pink took on jobs as a laborer for white families and eventually ended up working on the farm of the Long family, not far from his father Daniel's home in Harriston. It was around this same time that Pink met a young woman named Laura Argenbright. She was working as a cook for a white family in McGaheysville. The two fell in love, and in the summer of 1910, Pink proposed to Laura and asked her to be his wife. She said yes, and the two set their wedding date for the fall of that year. At this point, everything was looking up for Pink. He was working, he was in love, and he was happy. But the same thing that got Pink in trouble in Ohio was about to lead him into a Jim Crow courtroom to receive a Jim Crow outcome. And that was his drinking. On July 3rd, 1910, Pink left Harrison to visit his fiancée in McGaheysville. This was the moment that changed everything for him. He didn't just travel to see her. He took his .38 caliber weapon with him. It wasn't illegal for him to have it. Under Virginia law at the time, Pink was allowed to carry a firearm, and he brought it with him for protection. But remember, Pink wasn't just any Virginian. He was black. So while he was playing by the rules, he was playing by rules that didn't apply to him. Pink went on about his day, and he visited Laura. He had planned to return home, but it started raining, so he decided to stay the night with friends in the area. The next day was July 4th, and there was going to be a big Independence Day celebration in Harrisburg, and Pink planned to attend. Originally, he had meant to head home, but because of the rain the night before, he was still wearing the same suit, and he still had the weapon on him. He didn't think much of it at the time, because he wasn't planning for any trouble, just a good time. July 4th, 1910 was supposed to be a good day, a regular day for Pink Barber. Like other Americans, he was out celebrating the 4th of July holiday, celebrating freedom and democracy and the rule of law. But that celebration didn't last long, and Pink Barber would come to learn that what he was celebrating did not apply to him. Freedom and democracy and the rule of law were out of reach for Pink, and for everyone who looked like him. Pink boarded a train to Harrisburg to join the celebration. While on the train, he ran into his friend Ed Morris and Ed's father Henry. The three men decided to start celebrating early, so they went to a local saloon and had a few beers. After that, they stopped to get something to eat. A black church had set up a food station for black visitors who had come into town for the holiday. Afterwards, they joined up with other black people to watch the parade, and they had a few more beers. But up to this point, everything was going fine. Just fun and celebration. It was a segregated South, but Pink and his friends and other black people made the best of it. Around 2 p.m., Pink split off from his friends and went his own way. But at this point, he was drunk. As he moved along the street, he saw Dr. Franklin Miller. A few weeks earlier, Pink had driven a nail through his foot, and Dr. Miller had helped patch him up. So for some reason, Pink decided to pay him, but he was so drunk he couldn't count out the change to pay the doctor. After that, he stumbled toward a feed stable, and it was in that stable where things went from bad to horrific, where the course of events would begin to lead to Pink's end. While in the stable, the manager, James Lee, saw Pink and confronted him. He accused Pink of picking up buggy whips and trying to steal them, but Pink was just drunk and fumbling around. But in that moment, he was a black man, in 1910, in segregated Virginia, in a place he wasn't supposed to be, and that meant trouble. Lee didn't try to help Pink out of the stable. He escalated immediately. He began screaming at Pink to get out. Witnesses later say that he was abusive towards Pink. Lee picked up a board and he chased Pink out. When Pink stumbled back through the door, Lee picked up the board again and went after him a second time. Pink ran outside the stable, but Lee wasn't done. He ran after Pink with the board and chased him down the street. As Lee approached, with the board raised to strike, Pink pulled out the weapon that he still had in his pocket, and he fired 4 times in Lee's direction. One of those rounds struck Lee, piercing his heart, his stomach, and his liver. Lee made it back to the stable and called for someone to grab Pink. He died within minutes. Seeing what was happening, a group of men rushed to grab Pink. They were going to lynch him right there on the spot, but authorities saw what was unfolding and were able to wrestle Pink away from the crowd. 2 deputies arrested him and began walking him back to the jail, which was just 2 blocks away. But as they walked, a mob began to form. A mob that grew angrier with each second. And at one point, someone ran up with a rock and tried to bash Pink's head in. The deputies were able to fight off the crowd and get Pink to the jail safely. But the mob wasn't satisfied just knowing that Pink was in custody. They wanted to deal with him now, the way they always had, with brutality. Back at the stable, the crowd grew in both size and rage. A young white man named Sawyer Hoss stood in front of the group and said that he was in favor of lynching Pink. He then told everyone in favor to raise their hands. More than 100 people raised their hands in agreement and cheered for Pink's immediate lynching. And with that vote of confidence, the mob marched to the jail to seize Pink and lynch him. But fortunately for Pink, Sheriff Errol Karakoff was waiting for them. Hoss demanded to the sheriff to turn Pink over, but instead he was arrested. But the mob didn't care. They stayed, and they grew angrier with each passing minute, and they kept plotting. The sheriff had to deputize 8 men on the spot and post them at the jail just to keep it secure. That's how dangerous the situation had become. Now, this is the moment I've been building up to in this video. What happens next moves us from the threat of lynching to a legal lynching. This is where Jim Crow's system really shows itself. Not in chaos, but in control. Because what happens next proves that Jim Crow wasn't just about mobs and brutality. He knew how to put on a suit. He knew how to follow procedure. He knew how to carry out injustice through the courts, through the law, and through a process that looked legitimate on paper, but was deadly in practice. As the mob grew angrier and more violent, the town mayor, Oliver Roller, he ordered all bars to be closed. But that didn't stop the mob from gathering. The mayor then pleaded and begged the crowd to leave. That went nowhere. The mob could not be calmed down. They wanted one thing and one thing only, and that was Pink Barber strung up, period. And without that, they weren't going anywhere. The town's judge, Talford Haas, he also tried to persuade the mob to leave. It was only when Judge Haas promised that justice would not be delayed for Pink that the crowd finally agreed to disperse. Not because they changed their minds, but because they were promised a different kind of lynching, one with paper and ink, paid for by the Commonwealth. They dispersed because of the promise to carry out the foregone conclusion. You see, Virginia didn't need a mob with a rope. It had judges and bailiffs and electric chairs, and it called that progress. By the early 1900s, white elites across Virginia understood that lynchings were not good for business. The state was selling itself to northern investors as clean and modern and civilized. No more backwoods brutality, just courtrooms and executions, neatly filed. As one editorial in Norfolk put it in 1911, this state does not need the rope. Our courts can and will deliver justice with speed and decorum. That was the pitch. But here's the truth. Behind that decorum was a system just as deadly. They still executed black men for the crime of disrupting white comfort. They just did it in a way that looked good in the papers. This was Virginia's brand of white rule. Respectable on the surface, but ruthless underneath. And that's what laid the path to Pink Barber's end. And there's one more part of the story I have to tell you. This wasn't just any July 4th. This didn't just happen on any day. It happened on July 4th, 1910. The same day Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion of the world, beat the so-called Great White Hope, Jim Jeffries. That victory shook the white world. It wasn't just a black man who won. It was that Jack Johnson won with the confidence and control and defiance. He smiled through the fight. He mocked Jeffries in the ring. And he broke every expectation of what a black man was supposed to be. This wasn't just a loss for Jeffries. It was a loss for the myth. The myth that white men ruled every arena in life, including this ring. That myth collapsed that day, And when it did, white rage erupted all across the country. Violence erupted everywhere. White mobs rioted. What was supposed to be their day to celebrate independence and their domination turned into black people celebrating their own victory. Dozens of black people lost their lives in retaliation. And in Harrisonburg, they didn't need to riot. They already had a black man in custody, accused of taking the life of a white man. And that was all they needed. If the crowd couldn't get a lynching, they wanted the next best thing: a conviction, a sentence, and an execution. So, as you can see, this story isn't just about a black man taking the life of a white man during a drunken dispute. It's something much bigger, much more sinister. In a way, Pink wasn't just being punished for what happened to James Lee. He was being punished for something deeper, for the blow to white pride that came when Jack Johnson beat Jim Jeffries. As all of this was happening, Pink had no idea that a mob had tried to lynch him. He didn't know that Jack Johnson had defeated Jim Jeffries. Pink woke up in a jail cell with vomit on his black suit. He figured he had been locked up for being drunk and disorderly. He couldn't even remember what had happened, but he was quickly told why he was there and what was coming next. He had been charged with intentionally taking James Lee's life. As he awaited his fate, Pink's family came to see him. His fiancée Laura visited. So did his father Daniel. Both of them sobbed uncontrollably when they saw Pink. They knew they couldn't save him. They knew what was coming next. His father Daniel told him that the only thing he could do was to take his case to the Lord. And with that, he said goodbye to his son. Goodbye to the boy he raised. As I was learning about this story, I kept thinking about Daniel, Pink's father. I thought about everything that he had endured. He had survived 30 years of slavery, survived working from sunup to sundown, survived the age of black codes and convict leasing. He survived in a world where everything around him was trying to take him back to bondage. And now, here he was in 1910, an old man, and he couldn't save his son, couldn't save his boy. There must have been a crushing moment, seeing his son like that, and knowing what was about to happen to him. That's the part that struck me the most. Daniel had outlived slavery, and yet, here he was, watching a new system take his son. Not with chains or lashes, but with a courtroom and a sentence. And the pain was just the same. Judge Haas promised the crowd quick justice, and that's exactly what they got. A week later, Pink was in court, without an attorney. Reports say that he waived his right to a preliminary hearing, but I wouldn't hold to that. Pink wouldn't have known what a preliminary hearing was, let alone the consequences of waiving it. That was the first sign that Jim Crow's wheels of injustice were already turning. Next came the grand jury. On July 18th, they moved quickly to indict Pink. It was only after the indictment that he was appointed attorneys. Judge Haas selected Captain John Paul Jr. and Edward C. Marks to represent him. The trial happened just 3 days later, on July 21st. But what happened next to Pink wasn't new. Black people had seen this kind of courtroom injustice before, and they had already given it a name. The term legal lynching was used by black newspapers to describe the injustice happening inside courtrooms instead of in the woods and in the fields. And black editors saw for what it was, and they printed it. But printing the truth came with risk. Speaking out against Jim Crow was dangerous. And the same system that the papers exposed came right back after them. In 1926, two black newspaper editors, I. Willis Cole of the Louisville Leader and William Worley of the Louisville News, they were arrested for calling the prosecution of two black men, Nathaniel Barton and Bunyan Fleming, a legal lynching. Barton and Fleming had been convicted and sentenced to death for allegedly attacking a white woman. Cole and Worley said that the trial was unjust, and for exercising their First Amendment right to say so, they were arrested and charged with libel. But their real crime was naming what everyone knew was happening, that mob violence hadn't stopped. It had just moved indoors. And those two black editors were convicted for daring to say it out loud. That same truth, the one that Worley and Cole were arrested for printing, was just as real in Virginia. But white Virginians didn't like the term legal lynching. They knew what was happening in those courtrooms. They just didn't want it named. By the 1910s, black people in Virginia were being pushed backwards in time. The legal rights that they had gained after the Civil War had all been stripped away. And in many places, the law treated black people more like it was the 1840s than the 1900s. This reversal didn't require new laws. It came with a culture of white rule that saturated the courts, from the judges down to the juries. This goes back to something I said in a story I told about a man named Howard Wash. Jim Crow wasn't just a mob with a rope. He was the law. He showed up in courtrooms. He sat on juries. He signed arrest warrants. He called himself a good citizen. He didn't have to break the law because he was the law. In Virginia, the courts weren't there to protect justice. They were there to carry out Jim Crow's orders. And everyone in the courtroom knew it. Even though the outcome of Pink's case was already promised, there were still those who didn't want to wait. They wanted a lynching. Pink had to be brought to court under the protection of armed guards. That's how serious it was. Once in court, Pink pleaded not guilty on the grounds of intoxication and self-defense. By showing that Pink was not fully in control of his faculties, his lawyers hoped to undermine the state's argument of premeditation and spare him from execution. Pink's friends and associates who were with him on July 4th, Ed Morris, Henry Morris, and Ed Knight, testified about how much he drank that day. They said Pink had at least 12 beers in 5 hours, which is a lot for a man his size, who weighed only 130 pounds and stood about 5'7". Dr. Frank Miller, the physician Pink had tried to pay on the street, also testified. He told the jury how drunk Pink was. A black man named Flint Gasway, a respected barber who ran a thriving shop near the stable, he testified as well. He said he saw Lee cursing and berating Pink, that Lee rushed him with a board, and only then did Pink fire. But remember, this was a sham trial. The conclusion had already been determined. The prosecutor, George Conrad, was Judge Haas's brother-in-law. He called witnesses to testify that Pink was not drunk. The trial lasted just 2 days. The all-white jury knew its job. After deliberating for 15 minutes, they returned the expected verdict: guilty. They disregarded all the evidence of self-defense and intoxication. Judge Haas quickly sentenced Pink to die by electrocution. Everyone got what they wanted, and Judge Haas had kept his promise. I should also mention that the local press was relentless in going after Pink, because in order to justify a legal lynching, it wasn't enough to say he was black. They had to say he was black and deserving of punishment, deserving of injustice. And they didn't stop with Pink. The local papers went after his family too. The Augusta County Argus and the Staunton Daily Leader printed articles about how bad the Barber family was. They demonized his brothers and his sisters, accused him of forging checks, and accused him of stealing. After Pink was convicted, his attorneys requested a new trial, but that was denied by Judge Haas. They then filed an appeal. That too was denied. But it wasn't just denied. Judge Haas tampered with the court record to make sure it was. He changed the summaries of the trial that were sent to the Court of Appeals. He edited the testimony of witnesses to downplay how intoxicated Pink was. He crossed out entire sections. He changed words. He even added new testimony. He made it appear as if Dr. Franklin said that Pink was so cheerful that he didn't care to pick up his money when he dropped it, instead of the truth, which was that he was so drunk he couldn't. Haas also changed testimony related to self-defense. He rewrote one of the witnesses' statements so that it looked like the man had his back turned and couldn't see what happened, instead of what he actually said, which was he saw Lee coming towards Pink to hit him. There were hundreds of corrections in the trial summary. Haas wasn't just overseeing the trial, he was protecting the outcome. He was committed to keeping his promise that Pink will be legally lynched, and quickly. Even though everyone knew what was going to happen, Pink's family still tried to save his life. His brother Emmett made the last-ditch appeal to Virginia Governor William Hodges Mann, a Confederate veteran, begging for mercy. But that appeal fell on deaf ears. Pink Barber was executed by electrocution on September 23, 1910. The image we showed of Pink is the last image of him, taken just moments before he was led to the electric chair. We don't know what he was thinking in that moment, but we do know this. Even though his trial was orderly, even though his execution took place behind closed doors, what happened to him was just as brutal, just as unjust, as the lynchings being carried out against black people all across the country. I know this story is not as jarring as some of the others I've told, but I don't tell these stories for shock value. I tell them for truth. I tell them for dignity. And I tell them so that you understand what black life was like, what it meant to live in a world that provided you no safety, where what protected others destroyed you. Because this wasn't just about Pink Barber. This was about what the law became when it was handed to Jim Crow. This was about how the court replaced the noose, how the state replaced the mob, how injustice found a suit and a bench and called itself a process. And that's why I'm telling these stories, because I want you to see the pattern. I want you to feel the weight. I want you to understand that what happened to Pink wasn't chaos. It was policy. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a system working exactly as designed. So no, this one might not have shocked you, but it should still break your heart. It should still make you pause and reflect. This injustice was quiet. It was clean, but it was deadly. And that's what happened when the law leaves us. It happened to Pink Barber here, but it happened to so many others, time and time again. Pink Barber is not forgotten. His story is not lost, because we are telling it. Today, we are letting the world know that he was here. And I'll be back in the next video as we move through this series with another story, another name, another chapter in this never-ending saga of pain and injustice. But as I said before, and I'm going to keep saying it, memory is a form of justice. And that is what we're doing. We give them justice by remembering what happened to them. Now you've heard from me, but I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard of Pink Barber before, and how did it make you feel learning what he went through? And did you learn anything in this video? Leave me a comment and let me know.